righty then. Good evening, everybody. Welcome, friends. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're so glad you're here. My name is Rowdy. I am the Portland director of the Factory Farming Awareness Coalition, or FFAC. We are a nonprofit committed to inspiring and really empowering individuals, emphasis on that empowering part, and communities to create a more just, a more compassionate, and a more sustainable food system by educating audiences all over the country about factory farming and the power of our food choices. So quickly, just a few housekeeping items before we get started. The webinar is being recorded. We will share the recording with all the registrants in a follow-up email, along with additional resources and information from our panelists. The chat will be closed during the discussion. I think you have time now to say hello and where you're from. If you want to do that, we'd love that. Please post any questions that you have for our presenter and the panelists anytime during the discussion by clicking the Q&A option that's at the bottom of your screen, all right? We might get to your questions during the discussion. Otherwise, we'll do our very best to answer them at the end of the hour, including any questions that were submitted beforehand. Final housekeeping, it feels like a good day to remind you to go and vote. You know, we are fortunate to have that opportunity, so go ahead and go do that if you haven't already. Now, today's webinar is called Alternative Proteins in Politics on Labels, Threats, and Misconceptions. We have an incredible panel, people all over the country. But right now, I'm going to pass it off to our moderator. He's an FFAC board member and a policy fellow at Harvard Law School's Animal Law and Policy program, which is awesome. Gabriel Wilgen, who will introduce today's panelists. Gabriel, take it away, my friend.
Thank you, Rowdy. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. I'm excited for this conversation and very much excited to introduce you to our panelists. I think we're going to have a wonderful discussion. I feel like I have a much easier job as moderator than the moderator of tonight's presidential debate following this. As Emily was saying before we came on, so this will hopefully be a much more helpful and civilized discussion. I'm sure it will be than the debate later tonight. So I'll get right to the introductions to tell you a little bit about our panelists. So Emily Hennessy is the policy coordinator at the Good Food Institute. She works on legislative and regulatory efforts to level the playing field for alternative proteins in the United States. Prior to joining GFI, she worked on statewide sustainable food efforts at Georgia Organics as the Farm to School Director and Director of Programs. And previously, Emily was the Sustainability Programs Coordinator at Emory University's Office of Sustainability Initiatives. She holds a bachelor's in cultural anthropology from Emory University and an MPH with a concentration in food systems from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And she's also currently a Farm Foundation's Young Agri-Food Leaders and serves on the American Public Health Association's Center for Climate, Health, and Equity Steering Committee. So welcome, Emily. And we have Vince Seawalt, who is the head of regulatory science and advocacy at DuPont Nutrition and Biosciences. Vince has 18 years experience in industrial biotechnology and food tech regulatory approval around the globe, including external engagement to facilitate societal understanding and regulatory acceptance of new food technologies. Before entering into the field of regulatory, Vince was a Fulbright Scholar and Lee Pratt Nutrition Fellow during his PhD studies, a National Science and Engineering Research Fellow and Nobel Foundation Postdoc Excellence Award recipient during 2 biotechnology postdocs, and he managed teams in agricultural biotechnology and food ingredient R&D in 3 companies before joining DuPont in a full-time regulatory role. And last but not least, we have Jamie Athos, who's the CEO of the Tofurky Company. I'm sure you're all familiar. Prior to his current role as president and CEO of the company, he held a variety of other positions within the brand, which is also his family's business, ranging from a college summer job making tempeh to roles in quality assurance, research and development, and operations. He's also the founding member of the Plant-Based Food Association, where he currently serves as president of the board. The association aims to ensure a fair and competitive marketplace for all businesses selling plant-based foods, promoting policies and practices that improve opportunities for the industry, and educating consumers. As a category leader, Tofurky serves a purpose beyond the plate, acting as an engine for global change. And Athos holds a doctoral degree in neurobiology and behavior from the University of Washington and a Bachelor of Science degree in fish biology from the same university. So as you can see, we have no shortage of expertise and education on this call today. It's a wonderful panel of experts who work very closely in this area of alternative protein. And we're all here to discuss how the alternative protein space is regulated and what the current status is of some of the biggest regulatory battles that are ongoing around the world, and especially here in the United States. So before we get into some of the deeper discussions, I was wondering if we could just have a quick introduction from each of you as to what it is that motivates you to work in this space, and just in a couple of sentences. I'll start with you, Emily.
Thanks, Gabriel. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. For me, I've always loved food, and I think the impact of our food choices, they connect to the environment and to social justice and to animals and to all of these different issues. And so I wanted to work on sustainability and food-related issues because I love that I can incorporate that into my personal life. But then also impact policy and systems change in a really massive way, and on all sorts of topic areas, all by focusing on food.
Wonderful. So glad to have you here. Thank you for taking the time to join us. Vince, what is it that motivates you to do this work?
Well, so I'm the science geek that was converted to become a regulatory guru over the years, and basically started out in animal nutrition, in agricultural biotechnology as well, and then slowly got introduced to the field of regulatory, and quickly figured out that the pace of innovation, the pace of science, and the application to food is much faster than the regulatory acceptance and understanding amongst regulators. And so I became quite interested quite early on in trying to figure out, okay, what is it then about this whole process that could help accelerate acceptance? And you end up realizing that it all starts in societal acceptance, right? And particularly in countries, including the US, where public opinion ends up driving politics and policy setting. So I'm really passionate about helping regulators and the general public understand what the technologies that are used to make your food, right, what they're all about, what the benefits are, what the risks are, and to help facilitate the application, right, of new technologies, including alternative proteins.
Wonderful, thank you. So glad to have you here as well. Really appreciate you being here. And Jamie, thank you as well for joining us. And can you let us know a little bit about what brings you to this work?
Yeah, I mean, so you mentioned I have a PhD in neuroscience. As you can imagine, I didn't get that because I thought I'd end up running the Tofurky company someday. I thought I'd be a professor, and I thought I'd be working on drug development and discovery to help neurodegenerative diseases. But really, underneath that was a motivation to do good in the world. And what I discovered was that there are limitations in terms of how quickly you can impact the world in an academic sense or a biotech sense. And at the same time, my family was running a successful company, and I was seeing that the values that it embodied were my own personal values, that its impact was more immediate. You make a good food product and you can help people make better food decisions almost immediately. And that was so attractive to me. And that's really what motivated me to make this big switch after having invested a lot of time in my education and this other career to run my family's company ultimately. And, it's the best decision I ever made, honestly. Yeah. And I'm glad to be here and talking to a lot of people who are probably making decisions, younger people who are making decisions about how they want to impact the world. And I'm assuming they're here because they want to do good things too. And I think the food industry, the food policy realm, food is such an impactful thing, and the decisions we make as consumers in aggregate are some of the most important decisions we can make.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I couldn't agree more. And I think that's why the topics we're discussing here this evening seem so relevant, so important. I personally care so much about alternative protein, not just because of the billions of animals a year that suffer because of factory farming and our consumption of animal products, but also, of course, because consumption of animal products is one of the leading causes of climate change and so many other forms of pollution and environmental devastation around our world. And not to mention the massive public health risks when you think about antibiotic resistance that factory farming is exacerbating in a massive way. So I'm really excited to see that the plant-based food sector is growing rapidly right now, and that there's also some very promising avenues opening up in the cultivated meat space as well, and cultivated protein. And for some folks who are not on the call, I think a lot of people are familiar with what cultivated or clean meat is, or it's also been called lab-grown meat, although I think folks want to move away from those kind of terms and more towards cultivated. And maybe Emily, I know GFI works a lot on cultivated meat. Maybe you could give us just a very brief description of what that is in layman's terms.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to be clear from the get-go, cultivated meat isn't on the market in the US or anywhere in the world right now, but in the next few years, and Vincent, you can probably speak to this more, we will start seeing some of it available for consumers to purchase. But the basic idea is that instead of getting meat from a slaughtered animal, you take a small sample of cells from an animal, and then you give those cells the things that they need. They need nutrients and they need a warm space to grow. And so you put those cells in a large tank called a cultivator, and those cells multiply and they grow, and then they actually grow into animal meat. And so depending on what sort of meat you're growing, whether that's a ground beef or a salmon fillet, there's different intricacies to the technology, but the end product is at the level of DNA identical to meat from a slaughtered animal.
Thank you for giving us that overview. That's very helpful. And of course, these are very new technologies, and also even the plant-based space, there's a lot of new debate now that it's becoming so popular. And I think now that the traditional meat industry are seeing plant-based as such a big threat, we're starting to see some really big questions open up in the policy world around how these foods are regulated, including around labeling. So I think maybe we'll start with you, Vince. So if you could just give us a brief overview about how, what are some of the top issues that are being discussed right now in the regulatory space, and who is regulating these industries?
Right, thank you for asking, Gabriel. Yeah, when it comes to alternative proteins, plant-based meats, cultivated meat, and also fermentation-derived proteins, there's a couple of issues and a couple of different agencies involved. At a high level, plant-based is not all that foreign, right? It is not an entirely new concept from a regulatory and food safety perspective, right? It is more mature. Fermentation-based is also more mature in the sense that fermentation has been used for hundreds of years to make all kinds of very common food products, such as yogurt, cheese, beer, wine, and even bread. Bread is a fermentation product as well. The cell-based or cultivated meat, of course, is still in the research phase, and therefore the regulatory implications are quite different. Regulators are not familiar yet with the processes. There's no products on the market. They have not undergone any regulatory reviews yet. So that the regulatory space there is in its formative stages from a pre-market approval perspective, especially. And it definitely will have to undergo some time and some reviews, pre-market reviews, before you will see it on the marketplace. When will that happen? It could be as soon as a few years, maybe 4 or 5 years, before we see significant amounts of products. On the other hand, labeling, right, is of course a big issue, and there will be quite a bit of discussion about labeling of alternative proteins or meats, because they get compared intuitively with traditional meats, right, derived from whole animals. This is where the cell-based or cultivated meat will have a little bit of an easier time because the cells are derived from animals. So intuitively, they're a little bit closer from an overall composition perspective. But even there, there's already an emerging anxiety amongst livestock and poultry producers that cell-based will be very competitive in that sense with traditional meat. And so we're already seeing those signs popping up. In parallel, of course, with the resistance in several different states against plant-based meats being labeled as meats. Now, when talking about states, there are a number of state laws that regulate particularly how meats and poultry can be marketed, and labeling is part of that. And it's a patchwork, right? At the same time, there are federal agencies like USDA. They have traditional oversight of over meat, particularly the labeling of meat, as well as the post-slaughter or post-harvest, if you will, in a more benign wording, hygiene, right? So the food hygiene aspects. What we likely will be seeing is a movement towards a more federal approach, right, of labeling alternative meats, alternative proteins. Hopefully that will happen, right, to avoid this patchwork of individual states with slightly different approaches and then sometimes very negative approaches. So maybe I'll leave it at that, just at a high level introduction.
Yeah, that was very helpful. Thank you for that. And you raised a good point that there's kind of a third category here as well, the fermented protein space. Just very briefly again, in layman's terms, could you explain what that is and how that differs from cultivated meat?
Sure. In the case of fermentation, it's microbes like yeast or filamentous fungi or maybe bacteria, right, like E. coli, that are used often after a genetic engineering step, right, to express a specific protein and have those microbes produce those proteins in fermentation. The proteins are then separated from the microbes, so the resulting product is, in many cases, a pure or semi-pure protein source. The genetic engineering efforts were started about 3 decades ago and mostly focused on the production of enzymes, which are used in many different food processes, such as baking, brewing, dairy enzymes such as lactase, which allows for low lactose dairy products as well. So that technology is quite well established, and the regulatory pathway in the US is well established as well. And of course, it has taken several decades for the regulators to become really comfortable with it.
Okay, thank you for that.
I was just going to note that there are several products already on the market that we consider plant-based products, but actually also use fermentation technology. So
Sure.
the Impossible Burger, the heme that gives it that like red, bloody, meaty taste that they really think is the key to what makes their product special, that's produced through fermentation technology. And then also the mycoprotein in corn products is also a form of fermentation. So right now we tend to think of things in these 3 separate categories, but I think especially as we move forward, it's going to be more of a spectrum of alternative proteins. And you may see a plant-based burger that actually uses cultivated fats in the burger, for example, and as opposed to these 3 separate product categories.
Or a cultivated meat that uses a plant-based scaffold, right, to grow the cells on, to make it into a 3D structure. So yes, Emily is quite right. The lines between what is going to be plant-based versus fermentation-based versus cultivated will blur over time. And I think that's a good thing, right? Because in the end, it will all be meat, hopefully.
And exciting for consumers as well. I mean, I'm like some companies may decide to differentiate themselves and say, you know, we're purely plant-based. Others may say we're purely cultivated. Others may say we don't use genetic engineering. Others may say we use genetic engineering and it's great. And so there's going to be even more diversity of options for consumers to choose the alternative proteins that suit their their taste preferences and their all sorts of preferences are going to be able to we're going to be able to select from.
So that will be one feature, the versatility, right, of the application of these three different approaches, and to what extent they can merge with and blend with one another. But the versatility will be tremendous. And the ability, certainly on the cell-based, but also on the plant-based, to produce and tailor a product without wasting parts of animals, right, that are not readily consumed or have to be discarded. So the sustainability aspect, regardless of either of these three approaches, is going to be really important as well.
Well, it's so exciting to think about what is possible with these new technologies, the various permutations of combining these technologies. In many ways, we're going to be creating products that are far exceed quality and sustainability of what we get from animals right now, and of course without any of the cruelty, which is just such an important component for so many of us. And Jamie, I'd love to turn to you. In Tofurky's in the plant-based space, Plant-Based Food Association, of course, in the plant-based space. And right now, you're really on the front lines of some ongoing, very hot issues right now, especially around labeling when it comes to these products that are already on the market that everybody is demanding for in increasing numbers. And I'd love to hear more about how Tofurky, some of these battles are being fought in the courts right now. And Tofurky is engaged in lawsuits in Louisiana and as well as in Arkansas around labeling and using the term meat in your products. So could you please fill us in a little bit more what those lawsuits are about and how Tofurky is addressing these cases?
Absolutely. And actually, let me add a third state to that list. Our first lawsuit was filed in Missouri, and that one's still ongoing as well. So Vincent sort of alluded to this, with the rise of plant-based, there's some anxiety out there amongst the traditional animal agriculture industry. And that's being expressed, I think, in these legislative efforts to inhibit the growth of plant-based. And so what they're alleging is that consumers are confused. When you call a veggie burger, well, people associate burger with beef, and so it's not a burger. I think that's absurd. We've been eating veggie burgers for decades and decades. And also, like the selling point, the thing that we're all in the plant-based industry really emphasizing is the fact that these are plant-based products, because that's what our consumers are seeking out. And we've made some inroads. I think that the plant-based meat market share is up to about 2% when you're looking at packaged meat sales right now. And so we've gone from being a rounding error to a very small but growing portion of the plant, of kind of the overall protein market. And this is clearly just protectionism. They're trying to defend industries that I think that the market can decide. As long as consumers are not misled, then I think that basically government should step out of the way, and they're not misled. What are the alternatives to calling something a burger? Also, that's a familiar kind of form, flavor, and function that people, when they read veggie burger, they understand how they're going to integrate that into their own kind of culinary efforts. And it's just kind of absurd, basically. So Tofurky, our motivation here is not just to defend Tofurky's right to sell our products in the marketplace using kind of this everyday language that we're using already, but we care about this industry too. We've been here for a long time. We felt like we've kind of helped create some of the opportunities out there, and we feel like we're somewhat stewards of this industry. That's why I'm involved in the Plant-Based Foods Association. That's why I'm thrilled by the success of what you might traditionally call our competitors, but they're really not competing with us. We're all on the same mission here. For our various reasons and with our various strategies, we're all here to make a difference and to help, limit the negative impacts of animal agriculture. And I think this is something that all consumers should be on board with and care about. And our efforts are basically all about free speech too. Our council amongst, we've got the Animal Legal Defense Fund representing us in all of these states. We have Good Foods Institute representing us in Missouri. They're co-plaintiffs in our most recent case in Louisiana. But we're all on the same side, and I think we're all on the same side of the consumers too. And what we're making is an argument that this is just an aspect of free speech. We're using everyday language that's not confusing to people. And if it was, there are a whole host of consumer protection laws out there to prevent people from being misled or from fraudulent claims or whatever. So to me, this is absurd. And I think the outcome is almost certainly to fall in our favor. And the judge's ruling on our motion for temporary injunction in Arkansas was full of, all over was the phrase likely to succeed on the merits. And I think that, to me, that's going to be true in all the states where we fight these battles, because this is clearly an anti-American and kind of unconstitutional effort that they're undertaking right now.
Thank you for that overview, and thank you for fighting this fight, not just on behalf of your own company, but like you're saying, representing in a way the entire industry in these battles. Just a follow-up question from somebody in the audience, from Verena Rosa. She said, to what degree does it play a role in the court cases that this strategy is from the meat industry is so obviously and predictably aimed to protect economic interests rather than about the consumer's well-being?
Yeah, well, I'm not a lawyer, but I mean, just as a concerned citizen, I can say when there is a legislative record showing that the Cattlemen's Association is drafting some of this legislation, it's really clear whose interests they're hoping to protect. We're talking about that there's a debate about to happen and there's a big election coming up. I think our elected officials should be looking after their constituents, not just the people that give them campaign donations, but everybody. And to inhibit the ability of well-informed consumers to make well-informed decisions that are better for their personal health, better for the environment, and better for animals, that's absurd. That goes counter to what I think we're hoping our elected representatives will do for us.
Hear, hear.
And I'd note, in a couple of states, it's not even just the Cattlemen's Association drafting the legislation. Like, their lawmakers have made specific remarks of like, we're doing this to protect our industry in the state. And we live in a free market society where, the government isn't supposed to pick winners and losers. Consumers choose who win in the marketplace. And like Jamie said, this is just, these pieces of legislation are just completely counter to that.
And I'd also point out, there don't have to be losers in this. Industries come and go all the time. The horse-drawn carriage industry failed at some point, but people found new jobs. And the people that are cattle ranchers right now, they can find a place in this new plant-based or cultivated meat world too. We don't want people to be left behind, but stifling innovation is not the answer here. And using the power of government to do so is just absurd, and it offends me as a citizen.
Yeah, and I think finding alternatives for livestock and poultry producers, it may not be equally easy. It's probably easier in those animal industries that are more vertically integrated, like poultry and pigs. In fact, it's those integrators that in the end don't really mind where their protein is coming from, right? Whether it is plant-based or cell-based, as long as they can make the products that the consumers love. In the case of the cattle industry, that's a little bit harder to do, but I do feel that and this is maybe not the focus of today's discussion, but there are changes that can be made to de-intensify, right, the beef industry and make it more humane and make it more sustainable. So there may still be a future role for the animal industry, but it's not along the same lines as what we're seeing today.
And thank you all of you for your input on that. We also had a quick follow-up question for you, Jamie, from the audience, and asking, was the ACLU also defending you in one of your cases? And also they wanted to comment that they've been consuming Tofurkey products for decades and even converted their omnivore mom to Tofurkey.
That's awesome. I love stories like that. It's along the same lines. I've always really been, impressed with the work of the ACLU. And back when, in a different time in politics, it was sort of wielded as a criticism that somebody was a card-carrying member of the ACLU. I proudly carried my ACLU membership card. Yes, they're representing us in both Missouri and Arkansas. And obviously they're all about free speech and constitutional rights, and that's why they're taking up this cause, not because they want Tofurky to make more money or that they want to obviously deceive consumers, but because they're defending all of our rights to speak truthfully about our products. Just because we're engaged in commerce doesn't mean that we don't have free speech rights ultimately, especially when we're being honest about what's in our products. We're not obscuring the fact that these products are plant-based. We're shouting it from the rooftops because that's what consumers are more and more gravitating towards and seeking out on the shelves.
Absolutely. And Emily, we also had a question from the audience. I think I know the answer to this. Maybe you can take it quickly. But will there be cultivated milk or eggs as well? And maybe you can answer that briefly. But then also, I'm curious to know, what else GFI is doing on the regulatory front. There's obviously court battles to be fought, as we've been discussing. But there's also proactive things that I know are going on to convince regulators. So I'd like to hear more about what you're doing to work on the regulatory front in the United States.
So in terms of dairy and eggs, there is some work being done by a couple of companies on producing milk directly from mammary cells, which is really, really interesting. And I believe a small amount of work being done on cultivated eggs as well, although the focus globally is more on meat and seafood as well internationally. And in terms of other regulatory work, Vincent mentioned these, the regulatory pathway so that cultivated meat can have a clear pathway to market, so that when companies are ready to launch their products and sell them to consumers, all of the systems are set up and everyone's clear, both from the regulatory perspective, from the government side, as well from the company side, that everyone's ducks are in a row and that these companies are producing products that are produced safely, and that pathway is efficient and not more burdensome than it needs to be. So the Good Food Institute, we're working with regulators both in the US and some to a certain extent internationally to help ensure that those pathways to markets are set up. And then kind of not a regulatory focus, but another big area of our work is to try to secure more public funding for research and development in this space. Even though the alternative protein sector has grown tremendously in recent years, there's still some major questions that we think need to be answered, and that governments, just like they helped fund the technology for cell phones and GPS and the internet, can play a really important role in funding research that is open access, and all researchers and entrepreneurs have access to those results.
Yeah, it seems like that there's so much that government could be playing a role in when it comes to being proactive and actually helping these industries along. So it's exciting to see what's possible there. And there's also been some very relevant news just happening in Europe right now, speaking about international work. I wonder if you could speak briefly to what's been going on in Europe around these labeling issues.
So I think the vote is happening tomorrow. I haven't checked the news this afternoon, so I might have missed something, but the European Union is planning to vote on a label censorship bill this week, I believe tomorrow. And so we have an affiliate office based in Brussels, and the policy team there is working with a coalition of companies and nonprofits to try to fight that label censorship for the same exact reasons that Jamie described. For why we're fighting label censorship here in the US. It's obviously a bit more complicated in the European Union because you're dealing with a whole bunch of countries as opposed to individual states. But we are seeing these fights crop up around the world, and we think that it's a important step to ensure that companies can label their products clearly, and that it's not more burdensome for these companies to operate in the marketplace than their industrial animal ag counterparts.
Well, it really speaks to how much of a threat the meat industry sees these new products as being, that they're fighting so hard all around the world to try to suppress, using just basic terms that everybody understands, like veggie burger, veggie dog. So I think that all speaks to these. It's unfortunate that these battles have to be fought, but at the same time, I think it's a sign that things are moving in the right direction. And Vince, you were talking about fermentation having been around for so long in various ways in the food industry. And I'm wondering, is there something we can learn from the history of fermentation products that are now regarded as safe and approved for consumption, and how the current fermentation technologies influence regulatory approval around cultivated ag products, and what lessons can be learned there?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Like I said, fermentation has been around for hundreds of years, but it's become more and more sophisticated, right? And so today we're talking about precision fermentation, where indeed genetically engineered microbes are instructed essentially to produce specific proteins, or maybe there are certain pathways, right? Endogenous pathways are redirected to produce other small molecules, more amino acids, more vitamins, or even sweetener molecules and the likes. So that involved the use of genetic engineering techniques. And when those were first introduced, there were quite some hurdles to overcome, right? The regulators were not used to seeing products made with that technology. And so over the decades, from the late 80s through the 90s and into the early 2000s, the industry had to really organize itself through trade associations, both in Europe and in the US, to collect the basic data and publish that data, and to interact with regulators to make them more comfortable with the technology itself and the risks associated with the use of genetic engineering. And certainly there are a few risks associated with using that technology, and then how to control or minimize those risks. The technology has evolved over time, and this is more than likely what we're going to be seeing with cultivated meat as well, which frankly is still in its infancy as a technology. For example, in the early days, to construct a microbial strain, a yeast, for example, right, or a bacterium, you had to use markers, selectable markers, to transform the bacteria and then select the right ones, right, producing the most of the desired protein in question. Those were antibiotic resistance markers at first. Now, those have over time been replaced with metabolic markers or nutritional markers that are, that don't have the negative attributes, that don't have the risk of inadvertently transferring antibiotic resistance, right, from the target microbe to wild type microbes, right, in case of a spill or what have you. Luckily, fermentation is done under containment, so that's a lesson as well to transfer to in vitro meat production. We're not talking about microbes being designed for deliberate release into the environment, which and there could be applications like that, but they really have not emerged in large extents yet. So think about probiotics, right? If you were to create a genetically engineered microbe to function as a probiotic, now you're going to see very different issues and risks, right? Lateral gene transfer of those microbes to your gut microflora, for example. That has not been very common, although it's possible to do that. And there is actually a company that is selling a genetically engineered probiotic. It's Cbiotics, that actually has a bug on the market to eliminate alcohol in your gut, right? Basically by transferring a liver enzyme to that particular microbe and take care of that alcohol before it even is absorbed. So that technology is in place, it's available, but that is an application where the regulators still have to wrap their brain right around the risks. So the lessons to be learned are to indeed organize yourself as an industry, do research, right? And in the case of cell-based, this can be academic research sponsored, right, or coordinated by NGOs like GFI and New Harvest, to address any gaps in knowledge that exist around the safety of products, right, resulting from the technology. So New Harvest is actually currently undertaking a series of workshops with the stakeholders, the cultivated meat startups and experts to really hone in to those specific risks and then to define some research priorities to be done in academia to complete sort of the body of knowledge that the regulators can look at, rather than putting the onus on individual startups to produce all of that pre-competitive market data, if they can collectively benefit, right, from generating that data. This is all necessary to increase the understanding amongst regulators as well of the risks and make them more comfortable in really looking at dossiers for pre-market approval. So that's those are a couple of the lessons from the fermentation industry. By the way, I do want to make a plug for Perfect Day. It had not been mentioned yet. They produce milk proteins in a filamentous fungus that has been used for several decades. They filed a GRAS notice with FDA recently on this, and FDA, without any problems, reviewed it and provided an approval letter, actually a no questions letter, this is called. And they were able to leverage a lot of that pre-existing experience and level of comfort that was generated previously in the fermentation industry to get their approval very swiftly for this milk protein. Egg proteins are also being produced in yeast at this point as well. So it is a burgeoning industry.
Well, yeah, thank you for that. And, you know, speaking to so much of the scientific complexity here, I think it's so important that there are people like you with your kind of scientific acumen working in the regulatory space. So thank you for the work that you're doing. And thanks for also mentioning Perfect Day. One of the folks in the question box actually raised Perfect Day. I actually had the privilege of trying some ice cream made. It wasn't actually to market, but Raf, who's actually one of my co-board members on FFAC, had won some in a contest at the Good Food Conference last year and was able to share it with me. So it was neat to try some ice cream made with cultivated milk proteins, especially as a vegan who never normally eats any kind of dairy protein. I have a question that I guess is mostly directed for you, Jamie, from the audience. And that is, how do you feel about the whole quote unquote whole food plant-based crowd denouncing tofurkey and other alt proteins as ultra processed food, quote unquote, and it's actually nutritionally detrimental? And I guess I would add to that, it's not just the whole food plant-based crowd or some of them that are saying that, but you know, the meat industry itself is actually using that often as an attack. So what would your response to that be?
Yeah, you know, I think it's unfortunate that we don't have better terminology to lean on. You know, the word processed is such an expansive word. You know, you process broccoli in your own kitchen, you size reduce it with a knife, you thermally process it by cooking it and all those sorts of things, but that's not really what people are talking about. And I think there is a range of different kind of levels and intensities of processing out there in lots of different products. And the problem is we don't have a tofurkey tree. We can't just go and harvest it and have a single ingredient on the ingredient statement. So we have to kind of like reconstruct whatever the kind of meat protein experience is that we're trying to mimic with the constituent elements. And that entails some amount of processing. I push back on that, I guess, because, you know, I don't think necessarily that processing should be considered a bad word, and that we should have to be playing defense against those sorts of claims. You know, that what is the macronutrient profile of it? What is the micronutrient profile of it? How does it fit within your comprehensive diet also? Because we eat lots of foods at different meals throughout the day. And I think that we need to look more holistically at diets and how these products fit within those diets. And I don't think that we should disqualify things because they're a concentrated source of protein. I mean, look at how we've eaten traditionally. The center of the plate is a concentrated source of protein. It happens to come from an animal traditionally, and this is not a whole lot different. If you were to take a burger and break it down into its constituent elements, it would look shocking, all these little micro ingredients and stuff. But just the way that labeling works and the way that our kind of cultural understanding of it works, this is new to us, and I think that we need to evolve our understanding of what it means to be processed, frankly.
Yeah, so this is one of the misconceptions that I also try to help eliminate from the world. There's nothing wrong per se with processing, like Jamie alluded to. There are some ingredients or constituents that are better absorbed and that are more functional if they're left in a complex sort of matrix. fiber, right, is a complex matrix, and you benefit from ingesting fiber because it serves as a substrate for your healthy microflora, right, and so on and so forth. This is not the case with proteins, right? Regardless to what extent you process a protein, whether you isolate it or whether you leave it in the original plant matrix, it doesn't matter. Protein degrades into amino acids, right? And the amino acids are absorbed by your body. Some of them may even be processed by microflora. But it doesn't matter whether that protein was isolated, therefore processed or not. Now, what does matter is once you try to reconstitute a plant-based meat, is the ingredients you have to put in, right, to give it flavor, texture, stability, and so on and so forth. So depending on how evolved your process is and how much experience you have in doing so, like Tofurky, right? If you end up producing Gen 1 or maybe even Gen 2 with a lot of ingredients that add to a profile that is not very appetizing, right? With a lot of salt and things like that. Yeah, then a processed product can have a downside, right? But if you are careful about how you formulate it, if you use flavors that give that umami without adding the salt, for example, as just one example, then yeah, you're on the right track to produce a very healthful and beneficial, highly processed product.
Thank you for that additional context. Yeah, when you think about processed can mean there's so many foods that we eat that are processed. Even bread has gone through a process and is technically a processed food, right? So processed really does not necessarily mean bad for you. And that's helpful to know. I didn't realize that about proteins, how taking them apart doesn't actually make a difference when it comes to the absorption of the amino acids. So very helpful to know that. We have another question from Noah Dalzell, who I know is one of our interns at FFAC and also does a lot of great work at ClimateX and does a lot of research in the policy area around this. Her and I had a good conversation recently. And she's asking, given that, these industries are going to displace a lot of livestock farmers as they continue to succeed, how can policymakers better incentivize livestock farmers to transition to plant-based agriculture? And what role could alternative protein companies like Tofurky play in this transition? So maybe, Tofurky was mentioned there, maybe Emily, I'll turn to you in terms of what the government could be doing to incentivize.
I think there are endless opportunities for the government to incentivize livestock producers to transition to plant-based. Right now, they're not really doing anything at all. And the federal policy and farming in the United States are so intricately tied together. Billions of dollars have been paid to farmers this year and every year for the work that they're doing in forms of subsidies and crop insurance and all of this. So I mean, there's potential for additional research to be done about what that transition can look like, what sort of plants beyond soy and wheat and peas could be used for plant-based meat and cell-based meat inputs. There could be, robust programs run by the USDA where extension agents are trained to help livestock producers make a transition. I think the world, in terms of if you're young and you want to do food policy work, I think this would be an awesome, PhD project or master's thesis. There's just endless opportunity for what that could look like. I think the challenge is there the political will for that. And as we've referenced today, the ties between the conventional animal industry and elected officials are really, really, really close. So I think there are a lot of uphill battles that we face in order to get to that point, but the role of consumer demand and changing consumer preferences, I hope will push us in that direction. And so we can kind of go from the policy angle and the consumer angle and get to a better place.
Thank you.
I'd also like to point out that the government is intervening. Emily mentioned subsidies and things like that, but they're also backstopping bad business decisions too. You hear these high-profile cases of where there's a surplus of cheese or a surplus of butter, and the USDA steps in and purchases that. I understand that. We don't want to see farmers left destitute and bankrupt, but maybe instead of just doing that, they should also direct those efforts towards something that really does have more market appeal. And another place that they're intervening is, dietary guidelines and school lunch programs as well. They're kind of, creating this monster of this appetite for animal proteins, animal dairy proteins, and all of the above. And it's not necessarily what the market wants. And I think, removing those backstops and maybe redeploying those funds in a way that kind of helps to lead these farmers or these processors to be more in alignment with what's good for public health policy and what's more in line with the consumer wants and needs, I think would be a better use of some of those funds.
And then a third level where government, in particular the federal government, can be of great assistance is to indeed have an open mind for developing federal regulations, based on potentially a change in the law, right, that would preempt individual state laws. This has been done a few years ago for GMO labeling, right, and this is referred to as bioengineering disclosure, where in 2014, 2015, and early 2016, a number of states were issuing laws mandating GMO labeling. But they did it all in slightly different ways, so it became a patchwork. Now that wasn't good for interstate commerce, and Congress felt persuaded, right, to issue a law mandating USDA to issue a standard, bioengineering disclosure standard, which preempted several laws that had just been enacted, or one of them in Vermont that actually had already been implemented. That is something that can be looked into, like for meat labeling, whether it is for cell-based meat or even for plant-based meat. And the same thing, of course, for seafood products and, of course, milk products, just the same.
And by the way, the patchwork that Vince is describing there for GMO labeling, that's exactly what these state efforts to alter nomenclature regulations is going to create too. A company is not going to have 50 different labels to comply with 50 different state regulatory schemes. We need to have a unified and harmonized set of regulations so that we can all succeed, and that consumers in one state will be, just as well informed and having the same sort of nomenclature that's familiar to them as if they go to another state and purchase similar products.
Yeah, excellent point. And we've got a few questions left in our queue here. I don't think we're gonna have time to get to all of them. We've only got a few minutes left before I hand it back to Rowdy to wrap up. I think one question here that I think we've got 65 participants on the call. A lot of them are young people just beginning their careers. And this question from Eric, Eric, may pronounce your name badly, Servinskas is how I'm going to try to pronounce it, is asking, what opportunities do you recommend for young people that are already plant-based or vegan and to pursue, to truly live their values, to contribute most effectively to this collective movement, all while being able to pay the bills? So maybe we've only got a few minutes left, so maybe if you could each maybe take a minute or two to answer that question. I'm sure everyone would love to hear your input on that.
Maybe I'll take the first stab. So, I have the science background, and were I to do it again, I don't know if degree programs existed at that point that would be relevant to the food innovation, revolution that we're going through in the plant-based and cultured meat spaces. But that's what I would do. Take that time as you educate yourself and get a specialty that is relevant to this industry. It doesn't even have to, you don't have to be a science nerd like me to have a role to play here too. There's a role for marketing and sales people and operations people, operational engineers, process engineers. There are all kinds of different ways that you can be a part of this industry. You just need to find what your own aptitudes are and then let your passion drive you.
Excellent advice. Maybe Emily, will turn to you next.
So the Good Food Institute has several job openings right now, so I'd encourage you to check out our website. And we also list job openings at alternative protein companies around the world. And similar to what Jamie was saying, there's a huge need, especially for scientists in this space. So if you are in the science nerd category, there are endless job opportunities, and those are going to continue to grow. But I think throughout this space, whether you're a communications person or a policy person or a consumer research person. They're jobs for the entire spectrum. So I'm more than happy to talk with folks too about job opportunities if you're interested.
Wonderful, thank you. And then I guess, Vincent, the last word will go to you on advice to the young folks on here who are looking for careers in this.
Well, obviously there's a large number of startups as well that are popping up, and you could either join one of them, right, or get together with a few other smart people like yourself and start one yourself. Right now is the right time to do it, especially if you don't have any other obligations yet. It's a good environment we'll call it a playground almost, right? To start and live your dream.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the example that all three of you are setting. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you. I wish we could. I think we could talk all day. I feel like on all the various branches that come out of what we've opened up here to discuss. But unfortunately, we're out of time. So I'll turn it back over to Rowdy to wrap things up and say some last words and give us some information on what else is coming up with FFAC.
All right, that was incredible, super valuable. Thank you all for your time. Thank you to our panelists. We feel so fortunate to get to work with folks like you and help get this information out there. Just a reminder, we will send folks a follow-up email with today's discussion that you can then share. I will also have additional resources in there. Thank you so much to everybody that donated when you registered. We cannot do this work without you. We cannot make these things happen without you. So if you have the power to make a donation, we'll put a link in the chat right now. Help us do more awesome stuff like this. Our next virtual event is with Lauren Ornelas. It's called Farm Workers and the COVID-19 Crisis. So we're going to dig more into that and learn more about that. It's on Wednesday, November 4th. And we also have a really fun and impactful way to get involved called our Volunteer Happy Half Hour. So we get together, have a beverage, talk about how we can work together to move the movement and grow things at FFAC. So all that information is on our website. There's many more ways to get involved. Thank you all again so much for attending this event. And again, to our panelists, this was incredible, incredibly valuable, incredibly relevant. So we're really grateful to you all, truly. So take care, everybody. Go vote. And we love you. Bye-bye.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, y'all.